Often there are two sides to every story, but how often do we consider both sides? Our stubbornness can keep us as readers, or as an audience in general, from exploring the ideas of others even though they may not line up with our own. Beowulf was an epic poem that was believed to be composed around the 10th century or the early decades of the 11th, and it describes the journey of a hero, Beowulf, as he goes to a new land to defeat their monster. Throughout the poem, Beowulf is constantly described by the narrator and other characters as a mighty hero. His opponents, the monsters, are constantly described as evil and hellish, but most readers do not read from the perspective of the monsters. Readers' perspective greatly influences how the characters' actions are perceived and what they do for the character's reputation. Therefore, Beowulf should be read with an open mind. Throughout the entirety of this poem, readers are looking through a biased perspective of the narrator. Beowulf's character is described at the very beginning of the story before his name and heritage are known to the reader. He is first introduced as being incomparable to other beings. Quote, "There was no one else like him alive," followed immediately by some of his traits. Quote, "He was the mightiest man on earth, high-born and powerful." This is the same pattern for Beowulf's character, as he is a fairly static character. The narrator used different words to describe him, but they all mean the same thing. Beowulf is like no other. Beowulf's arrival speech to Hrothgar is mainly of arrogance and boasting about himself. He tells the king, quote, "They, my people, have seen me. They have seen me boltered in the blood of enemies, when I battled and bound 5 beasts, raided a troll nest, and in the night seas slaughtered sea brutes. I have suffered extremes and avenged the Geats, their enemies, brought it among themselves. I devastated them." At the beginning of this poem, the narrator introduced Grendel, one of the monsters, by giving readers a brief contextualization of the Danes. There is a quick turnaround in the setting as the narrator abruptly mentions Grendel's presence. Quote, "Then a powerful demon, a prowler in the dark," end quote. The placement of Grendel's introduction in the poem, the setting turned from light to dark, and the somber word choices of the author have a strong impact on the reader. The, quote, "fiend out of hell," attacks the ring Danes, killing 30 men. Grendel's other attacks are mentioned throughout the poem up until Grendel's defeat. From this perspective, readers are led to believe that Grendel is a horrible, inhumane monster who is, quote, "malignant by nature," and, quote, "has never shown remorse." Without the narrator's thoughts being so apparent to readers, there is not much of a difference at all between the two characters. Both Beowulf and Grendel are bloodthirsty in their own way, but the author uses that trait to villainize Grendel and to glorify Beowulf. An example of this trait in Beowulf is shown in his arrival speech to Hrothgar, which I already mentioned. It was mainly of arrogance and boasting about himself. Another example of this is when the narrator tells the readers that Beowulf had the strength of 30 men in his hand grip. The narrator uses this to honor Beowulf's courage and to emphasize Beowulf's strength. Quote, "A thane, they declared, with the strength of 30 in the grip of each hand." The narrator uses the same situation to criticize Grendel when describing the attack of Grendel that killed 30 men. This recurring pattern of the narrator is detrimental to Grendel's reputation and is beneficial to Beowulf's character. Through a different perspective, the reader will likely change their opinion of both characters. In October of 2006, the article called "Reinventing the Hero, Gardner's Grendel and the Shifting Face of Beowulf" by Michael Livingston and John William Sutton was released. Throughout the article, the authors used multiple quotes from outside sources, including both Grendel by John Gardner and Beowulf, in order to support their claims on how Grendel is falsely portrayed. They also make many references to other stories mentioning Beowulf. In doing this, they propose the idea that Beowulf and Grendel were both misunderstood characters. There are many different versions and stories of Beowulf, but according to Michael Livingston and John William Sutton, they all have a common thread. Beowulf is always the hero and Grendel is always the monster. Quote, "Beowulf stands as a representation of what is best in his culture. He is, or in some cases, he becomes by virtue of his growing up, the ideal man and the ideal hero." The text present Grendel, in turn, as the lonely outcast who dwells in the wilderness, the very antithesis of heroic, world of the mead hall, and the fellowship of fighting men. They follow up with the statement that these ideas of the characters were never challenged until the novelist John Gardner published something that completely changed the minds of readers. In 1971, John Gardner, a medievalist scholar and novelist, wrote an excerpt called Grendel. Livingston et al. Describe his work as groundbreaking, which is absolutely true in the sense of changing the reader's perspective of the monster. This excerpt was the story of Beowulf from Grendel's perspective. The authors, quote, humanize Grendel and transform him from an animalistic creature into a sentient being with human emotions. By simply humanizing the monster, readers do begin to see Grendel differently. They begin to see him as someone rather than something. They also state that Grendel remains the adversary of human culture, but through his eyes, we see a human culture that is ugly and flawed. This statement was influenced by the scenario in Grendel when he saw the effects of warfare amongst the Danes. Grendel remarked, quote, "It was confusing and frightening, and not in a way that I could untangle. He was sickened, and if only at the waste of it, all they killed, cows, horses, men, they left to rot or burn." Livingston et al.'s description of the effect of this quote is true, but it does not emphasize just the importance of the statement. Yes, it showed the reader that Grendel saw humans as monsters, but it also showed much more. It showed that Grendel did have feelings, including sympathy towards people, and most importantly, he had a sense of what was right and what was wrong. Maybe even more than the humans did at this time. Livingston and others expressed gratitude towards Gardner, grateful that he allowed readers to see Beowulf in a different light. The modern-day story of Frankenstein, which is familiar to us, is very similar to Beowulf, as both contain a villain who isn't always what they seem. Victor Frankenstein was a natural philosopher, and he was also extremely intelligent. One night he discovered the secret of life. He envisioned a brand new, more noble race, and he decided to put his work to the test. His first creation was so horrifying that he abandoned it and started over, hoping that the monster would disappear forever. Months after that faulty experiment, Victor hears that his older brother had been murdered. Victor sees the monster at the site of his brother's murder, but keeps it quiet, as he thinks no one will ever believe that the monster was the one that killed his brother. A family member of Victor's is falsely convicted and executed, and Victor is consumed by guilt. So this story is very similar to Beowulf because of how the antagonists of the story are portrayed. The villain in the story is seen as the monster and portrayed as a barbarous, green-colored being with scars on his face and bolts in his head, which is similar to the inhumane beast that Grendel is also described as. But are they really the villain? Just like in Beowulf, the monster is an outcast. And with both villains, society was very quick to judge who they were before they got a chance to defend themselves. Because of his deformities and attacks, Frankenstein's monster was the villain, but the attacks were because of Victor's actions. He created the monster, he rejected it multiple times, and he didn't create a mate for him. Therefore, it is Victor's fault that everyone he loved dies. This way of thinking is not often seen as the author's way of words tricks the reader into thinking that the monster is the true villain. So when a reader is reading through the lens of the author or narrator, they can easily be deceived. Is Grendel truly a villain solely based on his actions? If so, how does this make him any different from Beowulf? Beowulf is glorified for his attacks, but Grendel is desecrated for his. Readers must always be on the lookout for the biased lens of an author or narrator, especially when a character is villainized. Though seemingly hidden, the prejudice within the contextualization of many stories should not go unnoticed.